You know, sometimes in history, it's the smallest, quirkiest events that prove the most revealing. I want to tell now a story set in the wild, mysterious landscape of Pendle Hill in Lancashire, where in the year 1612, rumours of witchcraft, of sorcery, led to the arrest of 10 local people. Under examination, they confessed a sensational tale of souls sold to the devil, of spells cast causing injury, even murder. The so-called Pendle Witches were tried in Lancaster Castle. They were found guilty and sentenced to death. Now, why do I want to focus on this curious little tale from the margins of our history? Well, the fact is, it intrigues me. I've been talking about Elizabethan England in all its cosmopolitan glory, this breaking through from the medieval to the modern. Well, up here in Pendle, we've got another take on that moment of transition. But this isn't a comfortable transition this time. This is a portrait of a society in crisis. It's not easy to understand what happened here in Pendle, because the story at first glance seems so fantastical. The very idea of witches, peddled here to this day to amuse the tourists, seems like something out of the pages of folklore, of fairy tale, not reality. What sense are we to make of women in Pendle admitting to being witches? What sense are we to make of the confession, for instance, of Elizabeth Southern, nicknamed Old Demdike? She described how once she'd been begging in the village, and she'd come home through an old stone pit, and there she'd met the devil in the shape of a young boy. And that later, the devil, now in the shape of a dog, had sucked her blood. Now, I'd have dismissed this story as pure fantasy, were it not for the fact that above the village of Pendle there is indeed an old stone pit, a disused quarry, which means that buried within the layers of this fantasy there is some truth for us to uncover. The challenge is to pick our way through the story, pulling out the strands of truth to make sense of the kinds of women these so-called witches really were. One crucial detail leaps out. Old Demdike was poor, a beggar. She's described as almost blind, 80 years old, living in a hovel with only one garment to her name. She shared her hovel with her daughter, misunderstood and feared in the community because she suffered some kind of facial disfigurement. And she, in turn, had a daughter, a bragging, poisonous, uncontrolled girl who stole when she couldn't beg. It's pretty clear all three were delusional. All three were disturbed, broken by poverty. Most importantly, their poverty set them apart. It placed them on the margins of society. All right, so let me try to explain what I think this story is really about. I think it's about a very tragic moment in our history when the village unit started to break down. Back in the medieval period, villagers had no choice but to work together. They didn't own land individually. They each farmed strips of the village land. Those strips were rotated year on year to keep the soil fresh. And if that's how you farm, and that's how we farmed for hundreds of years, you have no choice but to work communally as part of a village unit. And I think back then people felt much more mutually interdependent. But then along came the Black Death, and the land started to move into private ownership, and the better-off yeomen fenced off their strips into what we now recognise in the English landscape as fields bordered with fences. And you add into that equation the Reformation, the sale of all the church lands, and the rich get richer, and the yeoman farmers become country gentlefolk. Well, here's the thing. In this new world of private ownership, who looked after those that didn't have land? Who looked after those have-nots? Who looked after the people on the margins? In the late 16th century, the problem came to a head. A growing population led to increased competition for jobs, And on the roads, vagrants became a common sight. Hounded from parish to parish, no one seeming willing to take responsibility. Eventually, the problem got so bad, new laws were passed, the so-called poor laws. Ratepayers in every parish were forced to shoulder the burden of poor relief. But it only made things worse. It heightened tensions, it heightened divisions. Resentments between rich and poor drew into ever sharper focus. There was a very wise Elizabethan gentleman, a man called Reginald Scott, who described rather brilliantly how divisions in society might lead to accusations of witchcraft, and it's a clue to what probably happened here in Pendle. He described a woman, and it's almost as if he's describing old Demdike here, going from door to door begging for a jug of milk, without which she would grow hungry. But in time, he says, perhaps she grows tedious to her neighbours, and they turn her away, and she utters a curse, and in time perhaps her neighbour grows sick or his cow dies, and he says, it's the witch's revenge. So, a more cosmopolitan society, yes, but also a more individualistic society, a more selfish society, a more paranoid society. And just around the corner were profound transformations in store that would test this society to the limits.